وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So today is going to be our final class, lesson 13. I've tried to compress this course as much as possible, and when we offered, inshallah, around mid-January, we're going to actually see if we can compress it into just 10 weeks. The purpose of this course was to prepare you guys for everyday street dawah in 99% of the scenarios that you're going to deal with, and especially with Jews, Christians, and atheists. There are obviously other religious faiths out there, but if you're living in the West, these are the three main denominations you're going to end up dealing with. Aside from that, maybe a fourth category, which is basically like a watered down Christian, or if somebody's been affected by secularism, then we need to deal with that issue as well. So today, what we're going to discuss is actually a lot of the isms that exist in the world. So we spent a lot of time in the course dealing with Christians and atheism. Now we need to deal with a lot of the political deformations and the political injustices and the political ideologies that go against Islam, either by contradicting it in terms of its belief system or being actual enemies and opponents to Islam. So we're going to look at individualism versus collectivism, what does Islam have to say about this issue? Because what we're going to find out is that Islam is calling towards working as a group, working as a jama'ah, not basically living like people who are, what do you call it? People who do monasticism. Monasticism is something that they said the followers of Isa alayhi salam did. I think it was mentioned in Surah Al-Hadid. They used to basically go out into the mountains and they would live like monks. That's what the Buddhists do. The Buddhists, they go as monks and they go live in the mountains. And then whenever there's political problems and fasad and tyranny happening within the world, they're isolated. So they're not of any benefits. They can't help anybody. And there's even a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, although I don't know how authentic the hadith is, but it talks in general about that Allah sent an angel to destroy a nation or a city. And this angel comes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and says to him that amongst this city, there is still one pious worshipper of you, O Allah. And Allah says about this one man in this town filled with people who are doing dhulm, and fasad and corruption, he says, start the iqab, start the adhab, the punishments with him. Why would Allah choose, based on this hadith, to punish a Muslim over all the kuffar and all the fasiqun around him? Because he didn't call towards amr al-maruf wa nahy al-munkar. He didn't command the good and forbid the evil. He isolated himself, and therefore the world continued to become spoiled. So sometimes the issue in terms of showing how Islam is true, maybe we prove everything in terms of proving God's existence, His oneness, proving revelation, that the Quran is perfectly preserved and filled with miracles, linguistic as well as scientific, and historical as well as futuristic. But even if we do all that, there are other issues that if we don't deal with the political issues that exist within those that are trying to attack Islam, then we're going to have other problems. So that's what this last lecture is about. Now we're dealing with the political problems that result of not understanding Islam correctly. We'll also look at liberalism versus Islam, or basically Hurriya versus Islam. Islam literally means submission, which is the opposite meaning of liberalism. Liberalism means you can do whatever you want according to their philosophy. Islam means you submit your will, your irada, your hawa, your will and your desire to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You accept the fact that you are the abd and Allah is al-malik. Well, as if you'll see in other religions, how they have started to twist the faith a lot. They're basically trying to make themselves the God and the Lord and the Master, and they try to treat God like He's the servant. If you look at modern day Christianity, that's exactly what they teach. They teach you that if you have a lot of wealth and power in this dunya, they tell you this means Allah is pleased with you. If you don't believe me, go to YouTube and then type in evangelical Christians or scam artist Christians, and they will use the name of God, and then they'll talk about the Bible, and then they'll talk about Prophet Isa alayhi salam, and then they'll discuss this point that material progress, according to them, means God loves you. Well, if you look at actually the lives of all the prophets, almost, like Sulaiman alayhi salam is an exception, but the vast majority of prophets in the Bible and in the Quran, were they rich or were they poor? They were poor. Were they all powerful in terms of political might, or were most of them weak and tortured and persecuted and even exiled from their lands? Even some of them were even killed during the pursuit of giving the da'wah, like Zakaria alayhi salam. So the reality is Allah actually tests people with hardships. That's why one of the slides that we looked at was saying that Allah tests those whom He loves the most. And then we also looked at a narration that says that the best of you, something along the lines of the best of you are the prophets, and then the best after them, and then the best after them. So this idea that difficulty is actually a sign that God is seeing really how good are you, that's the Islamic narrative, which is not being taught in modern day Christianity, and it's definitely not being taught in terms of modern day secularism. Secularism, as we're going to come to see, has to do with this idea of separating religion from the government or the state. So the dawla, the state, and a deen for secularism, these are two separate concepts, as we will come to see. And manifestations or branches of secularism includes things like capitalism and communism. Capitalism is basically the more of the American version of secularism, where on top of the fact that they don't believe they have to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and look at the wahi in terms of making ijtihad, to do tahakum, to derive rulings, instead of just not obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on top of that, capitalism says, and focus on your capital. Focus on making money. This is like one of your main goals in life, is to own as much property as possible, even if that means other people have to suffer. And communism, although it kind of sounds nice when you first learn about it, communism says that everybody is quote unquote equal and everybody should be paid the same. But that means that if somebody basically, lived a life of crime and then maybe they do some random jobs working as a janitor, I'm not trying to insult anybody who's working as a janitor, but my point is, they would say that a person who works as a janitor should get paid the same amount as somebody who's been studying medicine for 13 years in university and is a full-fledged doctor. Now, they built this in places like in Russia as well as China, this idea of communism, but it didn't really work really well. So from a financial perspective, communism failed already very badly, but then they also had another issue, which is the Aqidah aspect. They claimed that God doesn't exist, and they claimed that the only thing that existed in the beginning of time was matter, the physical cosmos. This goes back to the early writings of Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto. But all you need to understand here is that both of these, capitalism and communism, these are branches of the same root problem, secularism. The idea that religion and government should not be put together. And this started, there's a bit of debate. Some say the 15th, 16th century, and then some say it really started to spread by the 17th century during the time of the Renaissance or the Renaissance, especially in France, and then eventually it affected the UK and Britain, where this idea that the mutakallimun, ahl falsafa, the people of philosophy, they apparently, according to them, they know life well enough that they should be able to determine laws without going directly to the church. So they decided this mainly in Christianity first, and then there was a ripple effect, and it started to affect other nations and other believing people. And then lastly, we'll look at the issue again of like the Jama'ah unity in Islam and the issue of social justice, which I kind of spoke about at the beginning. That kind of goes back to the first point about individualism versus collectivism. If we look at the solutions in Islam, we will see that pretty much in almost all situations, if we want to fix a nation, we need to work as a group. We cannot all be doing something different, because if our efforts are going in different directions, how are we going to expect success from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So, regarding the issue of unity, we'll focus first on hadith. It mentions here, عن ابن عباس قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يد الله مع جماعة, which means that Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu reported that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said that Allah's hand is with the jama'ah, with the congregation, with the group, the Muslims that are unified and working together. The hadith is sahih and found in Sunan at-Tirmidhi. Then we have in the Quran, you find this verse mentioned many times in various khutbahs given by the Mashaykh in pretty much any city. So Allah tells us in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا. واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ كنتم عداء فألف بين قلوبكم فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا, which means, and hold firmly to the rope of Allah. This is obviously understood to be majazi, metaphorical. Hold on to, basically, put your trust in Allah. Put your trust in Allah and do not be divided politically amongst the Muslimin. Remember Allah's ni'mah, His favor upon you when you used to be enemies, and then He united your hearts, so by His grace you became brothers. We became a unified nation in a political perspective. So if we do this, then we see huge changes happen for the Muslim Ummah. One of the main tactics that the kuffar are using now, you just have to Google or YouTube the RAND report. The RAND report was a bunch of Americans and other secularists came together. They developed what's called a think tank. It was a group of people that were trying to figure out a strategy. How can we weaken the Muslims? And basically the number one criterion was to cause division, political divisions amongst the Muslims. So get the people who call themselves Salafis to attack the Sufis. Get the Sufis to attack the Salafis. Get the Tahriris to attack the Ikhwanis. Get the Ikhwanis to attack the Tahriris. Get the fundamentalists to fight with the modernists. Get the modernists to fight with the fundamentalists. And then make sure that the Western media puts the people who are mubtadi'een, people of bid'ah, people of innovation, and people who call to secularism, make them look famous, make them look really popular, so that other people will be misguided by them. So this plan has been going on for quite some time now, maybe 100 years or so. And you can find the report. They tell people to even try to push for racism, asabiya amongst the Muslimin. You see people almost fighting to death over a soccer match or a football match because this Muslim team didn't win against this other Muslim team. The Prophet ﷺ said, La asabiya, there's no tribalism or racism in Islam. And he explained that it's rotten. So we should take that advice from the Prophet ﷺ, and we should understand that when Allah tells us to stay unified and that Allah's hand, meaning His support, is with the jama'ah, if we don't obey Allah, then how are we going to get Allah's support? If we're not unified and we're not trying to make sure that we keep pushing for this unity, then how are we ever going to be successful? And unity doesn't necessarily mean we have to agree on everything. We've had multiple madahib for over 1,000 years. Hanafis, Malikis, Shafis, Hanbalis, they've been around for a long time. They used to have a lot of really hard and aggressive arguments. It got so bad to a point that a Hanafi would say that a Hanafi shouldn't marry a Shafi'i and that a Shafi'i shouldn't marry a Hanafi. And they wrote books and letters and poems about this. And they actually get pretty graphic, so I don't want to go into all the details. But the point is that this is one of the main weaknesses of the Ummah today. In fact, this could be the main weakness. Because if Muslims were unified, you wouldn't even have problems like what's going on in Palestine. You think Egypt and Turkey and Pakistan, just these three countries, you don't think they could take out this little tiny area of the IDF soldiers on this tiny little piece of land with these massive pieces of land, and these armies around them could destroy them like within days, if not hours. But the problem is a lot of sellouts. A lot of people were not unified, and instead they're unified. Their loyalty, instead of being their wilaya being to Allah, they put their wilaya in mankind and into their desires. Allah protect us. Allahumma sta'an. So next slide. So this is a hadith عن نعمان ibn Bashir. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. I'm just going to say the English for brevity. You see the believers in regards to being merciful among themselves and showing love among themselves and being kind, resembling one body, one jasad. So that if any part of the body is not well, meaning health-wise, then the whole body shares the sleeplessness, the insomnia, and fever with it. Hadith is in Sahih al-Bukhari. What this means is that if you're basically a true believer, if anybody in this ummah is struggling, your goal isn't to be like, hey, why aren't you as good as me? Why isn't your madhab or your manhaj as good as mine? Why don't you follow all the same fiqh opinions that I do? Or how come you didn't come from my qawm, my nation, or my race? And then you try to look down upon other Muslims and try to politically divide them. This hadith is telling us is that if any Muslim is suffering in any way, shape, or form, you are there to support them because you're one jasad, you're one body, and therefore, just like when the real body has a wound or so let's say you have an infection on your arm, then your body responds either with a fever or increased levels of like norepinephrine and epinephrine and adrenaline, and your body starts sending white blood cells to the other parts of your body that they can be healed. So the whole body responds in defense and in protection to another part of the body that's being wounded. When the ummah starts realizing we're supposed to act like we're one body, then things are going to start to change. But if they're going to say, you know what, my bank account first, or my special political affiliations first, then we're going to have some problems. Now we're going to discuss still more about unity, a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, that our Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, verily the believers are like one structure, each part strengthening the other. And the Prophet clasped his fingers together. Now there's a reason why I'm not going to clasp my fingers in the masjid. There's actually a hadith that says not to do this. And I remember one time one of my friends asked me, why do you think there's a hadith that says that we shouldn't clasp our fingers? And then I realized that I remember that when I used to learn in the church when I was a young kid and I learned Christianity, they always pray with their hands folded, one inside of the other. So for them, their masjid, which is the church, that's an act of worship in their faith. Now, I'm not saying that that's exactly the reason why we're not supposed to do it in the masjid, but it could very likely be the case, because apparently the issue of folding your fingers one into the other is only specifically not to be done when you're in the masjid, so in a place of worship. But Allah knows best. The main thing though here regarding this hadith is that the believers are supposed to be like one building, one structure. Each part of this building is strengthening one another. So it's like every Muslim is a brick, and if any brick was missing within a building, now the building is at risk of being destroyed. So you need to strengthen the integrity of this building. And how else can you do it but by making sure that all the bricks are firmly in place? Then we have a hadith which is mentioned in the Sunan of Ibn Majah, and the hadith was graded as Sahih, that Abdullah ibn Umar reported that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the believer who mixes with people and is patient with their harm has a greater reward than the believer who does not mix with people nor is patient with their harm. A lot of times people will tell you, because there are some ahadith that tell us like at the very kind of end of times, that basically if you find that nobody's listening to you, save yourself, basically. Like bite onto the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, like bite onto it with your molar teeth, meaning like hold firm to the religion, at least save yourself. But we are not living in these times yet. We are not at the point where nobody is willing to listen to us. If that was the case, nobody would even be in this masjid right now. Nobody would even be coming to masajid anymore and seeking nasiha, seeking advice from other Muslims. But there's a small group of Muslims that are trying to tell people, just worry about yourself. But if we look at all the hadith that we looked at earlier, as well as the hadith that we're looking at right now, you'll notice that Islam is encouraging us as much as possible to work with other Muslims, even if it causes you pain, even if it causes you suffering, even if you really have to be patient, because that's how you make changes. Like imagine a school. Imagine you have a school and let's say 5 out of 10 classrooms are like a zoo. The kids are jumping and screaming everywhere. They have bad manners. They're saying bad words to the teachers, to each other. Either you can sit there and say, you know what, alayka nafsak, mind your own business and I'm going to worry about myself. Is anything going to ever change in this kind of a classroom setting? Nothing's going to change unless somebody does something about it. So we can't have this attitude that, hear no evil, see no evil, and then let's just wait for Allah to fix everything. Even though Allah could fix everything. But He's instructed us to be people who actually make the change in terms of bringing people together. I think I accidentally hit the clicker a bunch of times when I was talking. Where was I? Sure, you can lower the volume, no problem. By accident, I went backwards to the other slide. So we should be on. It froze. I know, but Sheikh Al-Janabi, I think you have to click the website in order for the clicker to work. Now it's working. Jazakallah. And the recording is still playing, right? No problem. Jazakallahu khairan. So we should be just past here. So we just finished this slide. So, and then regarding the issue of secularism and liberalism, you'll see the core of the problem is people taking their hawa, their desires, as a god. So Allah told us in the Quran, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مِنْ أَتَّخَذَ إِلَهُ هَوَى. Have you seen the one who's taken as his god his own desire? And this is what secularism teaches. It teaches that the dawla, the state, and a deen, religion, are two separate issues. As we already discussed, in the 15th century, it started to emerge, and by the 17th century, during the Renaissance, they made it a big deal within the Christian communities. The philosophers actually just completely rejected the influence of the church, and they became just a symbolic symbol. Like, if you want to go to church, they would let you, but they have no impact on the greater sphere of political decisions, which are basically the affairs of human beings. Now it's fine. There we go. So, and the verse continues by saying, and Allah has sent him astray due to his knowledge and has set a seal upon his hearing and his heart and put over his vision a veil. So who will guide him after Allah? Then will you not be reminded? So the point being here is that if we follow our desires, how do we expect to have guidance at that point, when only Allah is al-Hakam, the one who is the judge and the decider of how life should be lived. We've already defined secularism already, so the separation of religion from state. And if you look at, for example, one of the main things that they claim to be able to do is they think they know what is Hasan versus Qabih. They think to themselves, this law seems appropriate, so let's vote on it and then let's make it into legislation. But it's still just based on their whims and desires. If it's not based on ijtihad from the Quran and Sunnah, then how can they ever be said to be really rightly guided people? And Allah tells us in the Quran in Surah Al-Qasas, He says, and who is more misguided than he who follows his desires without guidance from Allah? And also in Surah Al-Taha, so whoever follows guidance, then he will not be misguided or unhappy. So the way to true happiness, to true guidance, is from your Creator, not you trying to guess how life should be when you weren't even the creator of life to begin with. Just a second, slight technical difficulties with the mouse. So now we're good. So capitalism, we said secularism has many roots, and from them, these are just other manifestations of this idea of separating religion from state. So capitalism, as we said, is very common in America in particular, and now a lot of countries, even some Muslim countries, are starting to become very heavily influenced by this model. The idea of capitalism, capital means your wealth and your property. Whatever you can do to increase that, that's kind of your main goal and objective. They talk about also about, in America, they talk about the freedoms, all the personal freedoms that they think that they deserve. So in this model, it doesn't encourage people to really care about the poor and the needy, the misakin and the fuqara. So you're not going to see the concept of zakat being pushed in the American government system. Maybe every once in a while, somebody might donate money. A lot of the times, the reason why they're doing that is either for popularity or so that they can lower their tax brackets when they get charged income tax. But aside from that, they don't really have a strong drive to actually help people who are poor and needy, so they just focus mainly on themselves. That's also why, especially in countries that are more capitalistic, if that's even a word, like if you compare America compared to, let's say, like Norway or Sweden or Canada, in America, most of the healthcare and dental care, everything is privatized, or it's almost impossible to find any form of public healthcare. So if you're living in America and you live in a very low economic income bracket, let's say you're making only like $30,000, $40,000 a year, you're not going to be able to afford almost any kind of major dental or medical care within a hospital. And the government's not going to fund it for you. So in a very capitalistic model, they're not going to offer these services because they want to make maximum profits. So even at the expense of the livelihood of people, even at the expense of their own lives, they would rather increase the capital of the bigger money-making corporations and make everybody pay the same amount of money whether they have it or not. And that's obviously one of the reasons why capitalism is not a good political model. When it comes to the issue of communism, although we said before, communism sounds nice. The idea of paying everybody the same amount of wage and salary. So it doesn't matter if you're a farmer, or if you're an engineer, or a person working in a laboratory, or just somebody who's, just like a crosswalk guard, somebody who just lets people cross the street. When you don't give people respect for the amount of effort and their knowledge and expertise that they've gained throughout their life, and there's no incentive for them to even do these jobs anymore, because if they're going to get paid the same as somebody who doesn't do even half the amount of work, then how is that going to actually function as a system, as a political model? That's why even though they tried this in Russia and they tried this in China, and they still call these countries communist countries, in reality, it's a failing system. And so what's actually happened is that if China or Russia has made any material progress, it's because they've been switching to another model. They're focusing now more on the capitalist model, which is making them a lot of money, but it's not helping the people who are very poor and impoverished living in those countries. Then when we look at Islam and economics, we know that Allah is al-adl, Allah is all just, and Allah will give us the perfect system to live by. Islam is the balance between these systems, that it has the pros and at the same time it avoids the cons. So Islam allows people to make different amounts of incomes, and it will take into consideration experience and knowledge and hard work. But at the same time, it will always constantly be reminding those people who actually have a lot of wealth. If your nisab is over the amount of 85 grams of gold, there's obviously differences of opinion amongst the madhahib. Some say it's based on the 595 grams of silver. But regardless if you're following the gold or the silver standard, a person who reaches a significant amount of wealth now needs to give some of his wealth to people who are poor and needy. And when it comes to, for example, zakat al-fitr, then regardless, even if you're rich or like you just kind of have enough money to get by, even in this situation, because on this day, or the day that comes after Eid al-Fitr, on this day, one of the wisdoms behind Eid al-Fitr is that nobody on this day should be hungry. So that's why even people who are not super rich, but they have enough money to basically give the money for zakat al-fitr, or even better, the actual meat or the rice and the staples, the food that would be given on this day, because most scholars say it should be actual food. That would obviously be the safer position to take. But that on this day, even people who don't make a lot of money, even they should donate their wealth, so that those who are extremely poor, even they have food on a day of Eid, on a day of celebration. So Islam is always taking to the context the people who are very poor, and it's also warning against people who are being very stingy. So the Quran warns against people who are yani bakhul, those who hoard their money to themselves. They don't care about others. So that's basically from the Islamic perspective. And then the idea of cooperating together. So whether it's helping the poor people, or whether it's protecting the Muslim Ummah, or whether it's protecting us from basically, foreign enemies, we need to cooperate together. Even, for example, even in assembling an Islamic school, and whatever context you basically look at, when you want to look at improving a situation, it has to do with cooperation. So Allah tells us in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وتعاونوا على البر والتقوى وتعاونوا على الإثم والعدوان واتقوا الله إن الله شديد العقاب. And cooperate in righteousness and piety, but do not cooperate in sin and aggression, and fear Allah. Indeed, Allah is severe in penalty. The passage is part of Surah Al-Ma'idah in the second ayah. And Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhu reported that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam used to say, or that he said, whoever among you sees an evil, a munkar, let him change it with his hand. If he cannot, then with his lisan, with his tongue. And if he cannot, then at least let him hate it in his qalb, in his heart, and that is the weakest of faith. Notice that the weakest of faith is when you don't do anything physically about the situation other than hate it in your heart. So therefore, the reverse would be true in terms of what is the greatest of faith, that when you see something evil, you actually stop it. Now, in some cases, you can't do that, so at least then you speak out against it. In most cases, in the times that we're living in today, if we don't have the physical might to change some of the political injustices, at least we have a voice. If that voice is silenced, then unfortunately things can get completely out of control, and hence why the importance of always working together to establish social justice in the world. So very quick Q&A about what we learned today, and then maybe I'll just kind of skim over some review that you guys will want to focus on for your upcoming test, inshallah. So the first question is, what does Islam say about unity? So it keeps the ummah strong. We're supposed to be like bricks intertwined together. That's how we're supposed to be. If any part of the ummah is weak or suffering, we're supposed to basically have like a fever in response. And so when your body has a fever, what happens? Your white blood cells go to the infected area and your body tries to heal any part of the body that is wounded or infected. So you're supposed to have the same level of empathy, care, and concern for the entire Muslim ummah. And then the next question is, what is capitalism? Right. So in addition to the fact that it's part of secularism, which is the division of religion and state, it gives this extra emphasis on just trying to make as much money as possible and almost don't really care too much about anybody else who's suffering in the process. And then communism, they claim or they try to establish everybody to get paid the same wage regardless of skill, experience, and effort, which obviously doesn't work. And the other problem with communism is that in terms of their aqeedah, they claim that God doesn't exist. And they claim that matter just existed from the first place. And this was popularized by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, which at one point became so popular in Russia, they forbade people from going to religious buildings. So if there was a church or a mosque anywhere, you wouldn't be allowed to go there. They tried to shut down religion completely. It backfired. Not recently, but let's say probably a couple hundred years ago in Russia, you could not go to a mosque or a church or a religious place, but the people, obviously, they rebelled. Because how can you're asking people to deny their fitrah. You're asking all of humanity to deny their natural instinct to want to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So obviously that's not going to work. But I'm just letting you know that this was a political model that people put forward, and obviously if people were to adopt this model, it would obviously be un-Islamic. And we need to be aware of these different political isms and constructs so we know what is trying to threaten or challenge the Islamic narrative. And then how does Islamic economics differ from capitalism and communism? We basically already discussed that, so I don't want to repeat that point. And then what does Islam have to say about social justice? Does it matter? Do we need to call for it? Should we be isolated, living in the mountains like monks? Or should we be making sure that we help Muslims even if we have to suffer in the process? So we should help people even if it's difficult, as was mentioned in one of the ahadith that we looked at. So now, last thing that we need to discuss is that this was our last class for this program. And so the plan now is that I'm going to give you guys 1 week to review all the slides. So that's between slides 1 and 13. So we just finished slide 13 today. There's some slides that follow this one. It's just basically like a checklist of stuff that you probably want to focus on, that there's a higher chance that I'll put that on the multiple choice exam. That'll be online. So the test or the exam is online. It's all multiple choice, but you can do it from home. Basically on December the 24th, I'll put a link on the Google Classroom where you can access it anywhere. I don't think it's going to be timed. I can see if I can add a special extension to put a timer on it. But realistically, if I make it 40 questions, the exam, it's all multiple choice. It should take you about an hour. And you just see if you can finish it within about a 2-hour time limit. But considering the setup of the type of questions, it shouldn't take anybody more than 2 hours. So I'm not really concerned about anybody spending the whole day working on the exam. And so it'll be not next week. Next week will be your study basically time. So from now until next week, just study whenever you find a time that's convenient for you. And then not next week, but the week after that, which will be December 24th. I believe that's on a Sunday. That will be the day that I will post the link. If for some reason you weren't able to log in on that day because you had a fever or something, just send me an email or a message and I can, send you the link privately if you weren't able to take the test on that day. I'm going to try to make the test based on 95% on whatever's in the slides. Maybe 5% based on additional commentary that I gave, but it would be still based on the slides. So I'm not asking you to read any books of any of the resources that I recommended throughout the course. I'm just saying study the slides, try to remember what I talked about when I was discussing those PowerPoint slides, and you should be able to get a very high mark, inshallah ta'ala. These bonus supplemental resources here, from using the website kalamallah.com and wisemuslim.com, this is just for your personal growth. This is not something that I'm testing you on. So if you want to find out some of those dawah books that we talked about during the year, those two links have a lot of those useful books. And then from time to time, you can look at those if you want to continue strengthening your skills in the dawah. So a real quick checklist, not saying we're going to necessarily go through all of this, but these are just things that when you're reviewing, try to look out for some of this stuff, because maybe I might choose some of this stuff and make it into a test question. So things like the major sects of Christianity. So we talked about Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventists. We talked about the Roman Catholics. We talked about the Protestants, the Mormons, Jehovah's Witness. These are like the major sects of Christianity. So you should probably know some of the main differences between those. Why do I even care about this? Is because the goal of this test is not really to make your life difficult. And in fact, I've even set it up where if everything is basically almost based on the slides and it's all multiple choice, most likely you'll get a good mark. The main reason I'm going to ask you these types of questions is because you're going to end up dealing with these types of people if you happen to do street dawah. Then the discussion about the issue of the Trinity and how to refute it, as well as those who are for or against the Trinity. You should know that because this is probably the crux, the core issue that Christians have a problem with, right? So if you know how to solve this and you know which Christians believe in the Trinity and which ones don't, this is like one of your main things you need to figure out when you start giving dawah. Because if you don't know, you might spend 20 minutes arguing with somebody who doesn't even believe in the Trinity. Or if you don't know how to defend Islamic monotheism, then you might be arguing about the Trinity for 20 minutes. So that's why this is an issue you really need to know very well. GoRap versus GoRap Plus, because as we discussed, IERA, the Islamic Education Research Academy, has figured out that in street dawah, a lot of people want to hear about the spiritual elements of Islam. They want to know about the ruhaniyah, or basically the connection between a slave and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What makes a person feel close to their Lord? What makes a person feel spiritually fulfilled? And so GoRap Plus, the plus stands for the spiritual fulfillment, which we discussed and why that's important in street dawah. And then we also discussed, obviously, the first part, GoRap, which is to prove God's existence, His oneness, prove revelation, and prophethood. So all of this is important. And if you know this stuff very well, in most scenarios, especially for somebody who's not trying to fight you, not trying to debate you, they just want to learn or they're open-minded, this is almost always going to be enough information to get them to look into Islam. Then to know key belief terms. So you might not always use these in a street dawah conversation, but for long-term preservation of proper aqeedah, you need to know the differentiation between these concepts so that basically your aqeedah doesn't get polluted, or also a new convert, if they don't understand these concepts fairly early on, they might become compromised. They might fall into bid'ah, and it could be a small bid'ah or a major bid'ah as far as aqeedah is concerned. So that's why we need to make sure that they understand, some of these terms. So like a theist or a person who follows theism is a true believer in God versus atheism, and that's obviously the denial of God. That a true monotheist, you need to be a true monotheist to be Muslim. You need to believe that God is exclusively the only creator and the only divine being with no partners. Obviously, the mushrikeen are the polytheists. So we need to make sure that we differentiate between a Muslim and a polytheist. We should know what a deist is, because it's kind of related to secularism. It's the idea that people acknowledge God's existence. They believe in Him, but they don't believe they have to obey Him. So it's basically the same as secularism. There are many Muslims who fall into this trap. So it's not just an issue for new converts, it's also an issue for people who've been Muslim for a very long time. They overinflate their ego and they give it way too much credibility, and then they start ruling by their whims and desires, and that can take a person completely out of Islam. So we have to be very careful about that. Liberalism, and it's tied into being a secularist, so the idea that they think they can do whatever they want. So those terms are very kind of related. To be a deist and a liberalist, they're very intertwined. It's just liberalism is just more in your face, where they're like claiming they think they can do whatever they want, and they put that as their main slogan. And then secularism, as we said, division of religion and state. Obviously, we need to know what Islam means, and we should tell people that Islam means submission, because some people, they say Islam just means peace, like sakina. If people think Islam only means sakina, then where's the ta'abbud, where's the worship, where's the ta'ah, where's the obedience to Allah? What happens when you don't feel super spiritually fulfilled, but then Allah is still asking you to do something? As an abid, as a servant of Allah, then what are you supposed to do? Obviously, you're supposed to submit to Allah. And we should be teaching people that actually that ruhaniyah, that connection you have with Allah, is based on ikhlas. So when Allah tells you to do something, it might be difficult, but that might be the necessary steps that you need to take in order to, actually strengthen your iman. Then we talked about the Old Testament versus the New Testament. So the Old Testament, I don't want to make any promises about what I would and wouldn't put on the test, but just so you're aware, the Protestant Bible, and that's the second biggest sect in Christianity, they have 66 books of the Bible, but it goes as high as what the Ethiopian Christians have, which is 84 books of their version of the Bible. Still called the Bible, but just way bigger. The New Testament, basically all the Christian sects believe in the New Testament, and they're all basically the same number of books. The four main books that they care about the most is the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are books written by historians that their writings are 80 to 120 years after the time of Isa alayhi salam. The writers themselves do not claim to be disciples. The writers themselves have no last names and no lineages mentioned with their books. And their books say that it's the book according to Matthew, according to Luke, according to Mark, according to John, which means that somebody else is saying that they authored the book. So the person who even wrote the book isn't even claiming it's their book, which is very shaky in terms of credibility. But just so you're aware that that's what these books are, these four Gospels. And then the New Testament has an additional 16 or so letters and manuscripts, and they are mostly the writings of Paul, which is a guy who never walked, never talked, never met Isa alayhi salam, but he was a Christian bounty hunter who came after Isa alayhi salam was raised up alive without being crucified, and because he had a vision, or a hallucination we should say, when he was traveling on the road to Damascus, he thought that this vision, Allahu A'lam, could have just been shaitan coming to him in the form of a human, thought that Jesus came to him and said that he died for everybody's sins, and that's why he kept proclaiming that message instead of having iman wa amalu salihat like al-Hawariyun and like Isa alayhi salam clearly called to in the Bible. Then you might want to just know about the famous personalities that we talked about. Maybe I might ask some questions about some of the main skills that these different du'at offer. And you should know these names, because if you Google and YouTube them after you take this course or during this course, you're going to learn boatloads of information. And on those very specific, really tricky questions, if you just look at the du'at that I mentioned in this program, they're probably going to deal with 99% of the very hard questions that you might face on very rare occasions in street dawah. The meaning of parakletos and paraklotos, which I think I might have discussed when the recording was on, or I know I discussed it beforehand, but parakletos, that the Prophet ﷺ is a shafi'ah, he's an intercessor, which is one of his names actually, and on the Day of Judgment he will intercede for his ummah. And then the paraklotos, which means the praised one, which is the meaning of the name Muhammad, and Isa alayhi salam may have used either term, because the Bible in the Kohen Greek version uses the word parakletos, but some argue that it was a misspelling and it should have said actually paraklotos. In either way, both attributes are attributes of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, And Isa alayhi salam did not claim to be the last prophet, and he claimed or stated actually that another prophet would basically come after him. So the question is, was it Paul or was it Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Obviously, after a deeper discussion, we can easily prove to Christians that the Quran is a miracle from Allah sent to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that Paul really didn't come with anything except contradicting the message of Isa alayhi salam. It is the Torah, but they say the first 5 books are really what they mean. They focus on the Torah. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those first 5 books of the Bible are really what's called the Torah. Most of the rest of the Old Testament is Qasas al-Anbiya, stories of the prophets. So, but it's all put together as Old Testament. When we say Torah, we're really mainly focusing on the first 5 books, and especially the books of Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, because those 3 books have to do with al-ahkam shar'iyya for the Yahud. While as the book of Genesis, most has to do with life of Adam alayhi salam and how he came down from Jannah, and the book of Exodus deals with the story of Musa alayhi salam and Fir'aun. Where was Mount Sila? We know that it's mentioned as the mountain in Medina, as mentioned in the book of Isaiah. So the Jews knew where where Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would establish justice. As we talked about that already. And because we're running out of time, there's some more points on the checklist. So just look through the checklist and look through the slides, and inshallah you guys should be firmly prepared for the exam coming up in 2 weeks from now, inshallah ta'ala. If you guys have any questions, feel free to message me on the Google Classroom. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. وإياك.